Canelo Alvarez versus Daniel Jacobs. Let's talk about the fight. You know, ahead of this fight, I figured that Daniel Jacobs is going to go in there and he's going to try to impose his will against Canelo Alvarez. He's going to have to take chances, and he's going to take those chances because he knows he can't afford to coast. He can't afford to be complacent. He can't afford to let rounds slip away where he could be doing more, but he's playing it safe. I figured that Daniel Jacobs is going to go in there looking for the knockout. And Daniel Jacobs himself said as much, and I believed him. I believed that Daniel Jacobs was going to go in there and be the aggressor looking for the knockout, thereby opening the door for him to get knocked out. These things happen. But they didn't happen last night. I figured that Daniel Jacobs would lose this thing by way of knockout, and that's not what happened. So let's talk about what did. First and foremost, I have no issues how the fight was scored. There's no controversy. Doesn't smell like a hometown decision. It really doesn't. I think it was a closely fought fight, a competitive fight, a chess match at times, but I don't think it was controversial. I don't think it was a robbery. I agree with the judge's decision. I think that Daniel Jacobs gave a solid effort. Both guys did. Both guys showed their virtues. Both guys showed some really good boxing. But where Daniel Jacobs really came up short, and what costed him, was the defensive prowess of Canelo Alvarez.
Which was on point.
That while Daniel Jacobs, you know, in those moments, in those pockets where these guys are mixing it up in close proximity to each other and Daniel Jacobs is stringing together punches, whether it was center ring, on the move, or on the ropes, the defensive prowess of Canelo Alvarez was on full display last night. The way he was slipping and sliding around Daniel Jacobs' combinations, the way that Canelo was getting under or around those shots, constantly deflecting, rolling, slipping, sliding. I mean, in that way, you really can't give effective aggression to a guy who's missing that many punches. That's not saying that Daniel Jacobs didn't have moments. That's just saying that more often than not, round by round, as Daniel Jacobs tries to come on, it's really not effective aggression, because how effective could it be if you're missing? And bear in mind that we're not talking about a guy who's far on the outside using lateral movement to avoid engaging his opponent altogether. We're not talking about a guy like that. We're not talking about a guy who's just taking a tour of the turnbuckles to avoid getting hit. We're talking about a guy who's within close proximity of Daniel Jacobs. They're both in the pocket. They're both within striking distance of each other. As Daniel Jacobs tries to come on, Canelo Alvarez offsets what's being thrown at him, whereas Canelo himself, more often than not, was throwing photo finish punches. Punches you don't have to look hard to see. Punches that the judges don't have to look hard to see. And if you're already familiar with the premise that rounds are scored under, you'll already know that clean punching, effective aggression, and defense count towards winning a round. And more often than not, Canelo Alvarez exhibited all three, round by round, more often than not. And I reiterate, it's not that Daniel Jacobs didn't give a solid effort. He really did. It was a good fight, and there wasn't much missing from his game plan. It's just that this is Canelo Alvarez. This is a pound-for-pound fighter, one of the most skilled guys that are out there. So you're not just going to go in there and have your way with him. Daniel Jacobs put forth a valiant effort, and he held his own. But holding your own doesn't win you the fight. Imposing your will does. Thinking back upon the fight, you know, more often than not, which one of these two guys did you see giving up ground? More often than not, it was Daniel Jacobs. And in those moments where Daniel Jacobs managed to get off some combinations against Canelo Alvarez, whether they landed or didn't land, didn't we see Canelo Alvarez fight his way off the ropes and land combinations of his own against Daniel Jacobs? Except when Canelo did it, the punches were more clean. You didn't have to look too hard to find them. They weren't just glancing shots. These are thudding blows. That whether we're talking about shots that landed upstairs or shots that landed downstairs, not only are these shots that landed, but they were clear, clean punches. Canelo might fire a hair-trigger jab, a very quick flick jab that'll push Daniel Jacobs' head back, or he'll fire a hook downstairs. A hook aimed towards Daniel Jacobs' midsection that at minimum was slapping the shit out of his hip. But one way or another, the work was there, the work was clean, and you didn't have to look too hard to find it. You look at the final punch stats for this thing and how they reflect the action, the point of reference for who's doing what and how often. And Canelo Alvarez, in the realm of body punches landed, he landed 40% of his body punches to Daniel Jacobs' 20%. That's saying that Daniel Jacobs landed half the body punches that Canelo did. You look at the total jabs landed, and Canelo landed 33% of his jabs to 14% of Daniel Jacobs' jabs. And then you look at the overall power punches landed. landed. Canelo Alvarez landed 45% of his power punches to Daniel Jacobs' 24%. And what that basically means is that while the aesthetic of the fight is competitive, it's really not as close as you might think. It's really not as close as your eyes are leading you to believe, because one of these guys actually is the busier guy, the more efficient, more effective guy, more often, round by round. And that guy was Canelo Alvarez. So in that way, ring generalship is going to go to the guy who's fighting his fight. And Canelo Alvarez was always fighting his fight in this fight with Daniel Jacobs. He never went out there looking uncomfortable, looking out of place, looking perplexed or confused. More often than not, Canelo Alvarez looked cool as a cucumber out there, fighting his fight and being effective in doing so. With photo finish punches and defensive highlights, this was not a hard fight to score. And I want you guys to realize something. I'm not partial to Canelo Alvarez. I'm not a fucking fan of that guy. I wouldn't look for rounds to give Canelo Alvarez because he's my countryman or because we're the same race. I'm not even a fan of this guy. But at the end of the day, when I scored the fight, I had it 7-5 Canelo Alvarez. Not a hard fight to score. Competitive at times, chess match at times, but more or less a clear Canelo victory. And I realized that that might be much to the chagrin of some fight fans out there who are critical of Canelo Alvarez because he's been associated with some very controversial scorecards. Hey, I understand that. I'm fully aware of that, and I don't dismiss it. But if what we're doing here is scoring this fight, if what we're doing is scoring the fight that is in front of us right now, then you've got to put your baggage from those fights to the side and score the actual fight that you're watching. A lot of times, people get emotionally invested in fighters. They may or may not like a fighter, thus they're always looking for a means and a method to detract, to take away from a fighter. Whereas, look, I'm not a fan of Canelo Alvarez. I don't make any excuses for this guy. I'm fully aware he walks into a fight with a lot of advantages that aren't immediately visible to the naked eye. I'm fully aware of that. I get it. I understand it. But if I'm going to score the fight on the premise that fights are scored upon effective aggression, ring generalship, defense, and clean punching, and I'm scoring each round on that premise, and this is the fight that I'm applying that to, well, yeah, I had it 7-5, Canelo Alvarez. And I don't make excuses for Canelo. I don't pull punches on him or any of that shit. Anybody that follows this channel knows that. I'm just saying that last night's fight, yeah, it was a clear Canelo victory. I'm not even a fan of that guy, and I can admit that. So perhaps you guys out there should try it sometime. Because I see that there are people saying they had it 8-4 Jacobs, and I don't know how you could have found 8 rounds to give Daniel Jacobs. That's just fucking ridiculous. And I gather that the motivation for that kind of a scorecard would have to be that you really just don't like Canelo. Hey, I'm not a fan of him either, dog. But I know how to score a fight. You know, I mean, at least I can score one better than you can if you had it 8-4 Daniel Jacobs. I mean, give me a fucking break. I don't even like Canelo, and I didn't get a shitty-looking scorecard like that. And believe me, there are those people. There are those people. If you hit up the Facebook boxing groups, you'll see plenty of guys saying just that kind of silly shit. Bottom line, you got your opinion. You scored it how you scored it. Hey, I scored it how I scored it. I don't even like Canelo, and I had it 7-5 Canelo Alvarez. I also wanted to add that, you know, Daniel Jacobs, he fought valiantly. I don't take that away from him. He even managed to land a really big left hook on Canelo Alvarez. The kind of left hook that would have floored most other middleweights in the entire weight class. You know, a real money shot. Canelo took it in stride, kept it moving, kept lurking. Didn't even break a sweat. You know, Canelo, he showed why he is who he is, why some people consider him to be one of the best fighters in the sport of boxing. So, you know, good night of boxing, good fight, competitive fight, but I had it for Canelo. I think that Canelo won the fight, and that's not saying that Daniel Jacobs didn't pose some resistance or that he didn't make it competitive. He did. He put forth a valiant effort. But there were some things he didn't do, and some things that he did do, that I feel costed him. The switch hitting was one. You know, everybody's not switch hitting on the level of a Terrence Crawford. Let's get that right out of the way. When he switch hits, it's at the elite level. It's not a hindrance to his game plan, whereas for Daniel Jacobs, yeah, it seemed like a hindrance. He had more success out of the orthodox stance than the southpaw stance, but, you know, he kept switch hitting
throughout the fight.
And it's a novelty. It's a novel approach. It's not necessary for you to be a switch hitter to win a fight or to have success as a professional boxer. You don't have to be a switch hitter. But we see guys go out there and do this at times, and they're not doing it on the level of a Terrence Crawford, so sometimes it's a hindrance. I mean, not that long ago, we saw...
About a week ago.
Saw Rumvisai. You know, he goes out there, and he's a southpaw, but he decides to go out there fighting an orthodox stance, and I think that costed him. And in the way that costed him, I think Daniel Jacobs' switch hitting costed him in this fight with Canelo. He had more success as an orthodox fighter, and he should have stuck with that. Perhaps had he not, been switch hitting, maybe it would have been closer. Maybe he could have eked it. Yeah, likely, unlikely, whatever. Point is, I do think that the switch hitting came at a cost to Daniel Jacobs. So, this really wasn't a hard fight to score, to be completely honest. It just wasn't. Those things in mind, Canelo Alvarez unifying 3 of the 4 world titles, not even counting the Ring Magazine belt. Canelo Alvarez, unified middleweight lineal champion, ascends to the number 2 spot on the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list. As is true with all pound-for-pound lists that are floating around out there in the boxing cosmos, I'm sure that there are people looking at this list and they have their own anecdotes, their own contentions about who should be where, how the list should be structured, but do realize that this list operates on a set criteria that governs who goes where based on what. It's not subject to my opinion any more than it's subject to yours. And it just so happens that not only has Canelo Alvarez bumped Vasyl Lomachenko to the number 3 spot, but there's a rhyme and a reason behind it. Canelo Alvarez has fought more world champions, active world champions. We're not talking about guys who used to be champions but weren't holding a belt the night of the fight. We're talking about guys who were champions that actually had a belt for Canelo to win. Canelo Alvarez has beaten more active reigning world champions than Vasyl Lomachenko, 5 world champions to Vasyl Lomachenko's 3, and
he's got more belts.
He's currently holding more world titles than Vasyl Lomachenko. So even though Lomachenko has fought in 1 more weight class, that is, he's been a full-fledged champion in 1 more weight class than Canelo Alvarez.
Yeah.
Canelo outweighs his accomplishments by having defeated more active world champions and currently holding more world titles. It's close. It's close. If Vasyl Lomachenko in his next fight, or his next 2 fights, by some chance unifies 3 world titles, then he'll ascend back to the number 2 spot and bump Canelo down to number 3. You understand? It's close. It's close because these guys are the best of the best. It's close because these guys have similar accomplishments and they operate at the highest level. It's close to where it can be interchangeable in that way, depending on what the next accomplishment is. But right now, Canelo Alvarez has in fact defeated more active world champions than Vasyl Lomachenko, and he's currently holding more world titles than he is. So that's enough for him to slide into that number 2 spot. And what it's going to take for Vasyl Lomachenko to reclaim that position is to unify a 3rd world title, because then he will be holding the same number of world titles as Canelo Alvarez currently holds right now, but Vasyl Lomachenko will have been a full-fledged champion in 1 more weight class than Canelo Alvarez has, because that WBA baby belt,
168.
That don't count. That's not a full world title. That's not the version of the title that can be unified with that of a rival organizations. If Vasyl Lomachenko were to hypothetically face, say, Richard Comey and win his IBF, that would make his argument credible enough, based on the rules that govern this list, for him to reclaim that number 2 spot. Now, I know that there are some others out there whose pound-for-pound lists are more emotionally driven, based on their own personal opinions, preferences, and anecdotes. But need I remind you that these fighters don't end up in these conversations based on your anecdotes, based on your opinions. There's a reason that certain fighters' names are always brought up in regards to the pound-for-pound list and the overall pound-for-pound conversation. Somebody might look at a list like this that uses these fighters' accomplishments to measure them against each other, where they will be ranked as such. Somebody might look at a list like this and say, well, I thought the pound-for-pound list was about skill, not accomplishments. Well, do realize, genius, these fighters' accomplishments are a reflection of their skills. Had they not been so skilled, they wouldn't have been able to rack up that many accomplishments. Hell, if they didn't rack up those accomplishments, they wouldn't even be in the conversation in the first place. People aren't sitting around talking about Vasyl Lomachenko, for example, for no reason. It's because he's become a 3-division champion in a very short amount of time, fighting credible opponents that have world titles for him to win, where most other fighters are still on the bring-along process. This guy, in a very short amount of time, in very few professional fights, managed to climb up not only 3 weight classes, but become a champion in all of them, and a unified champion in his current prescribed weight class. That's what gets you in the conversation, and that's what gets you on the list, and that's what moves you up or down, depending on who's in front of you or behind you and whatever they manage to accomplish. That's what gets you in the conversation overall. That's what gets you on the list. What you manage to accomplish, because it takes skill, elite level skills, pound for pound skills, to have accomplished so much. You know, I can't tell you how asinine a statement that is when you hear a guy say, well, I thought the pound for pound list was about skills, not accomplishments. Well, if you didn't have fucking skills, you wouldn't have accomplishments. It's the only fucking reason anybody's talking about you in that context to begin with. You know, some people want pound for pound lists to be more subject to opinions and personal preferences, anecdotes. Two guys can watch the same fight and perceive that fight two very different ways. You understand? So opinions are no barometer for skill. Anecdotes are no barometer for skill. What is done, what is proven, what is finite and a matter of fact is the only real barometer for skill. That's the gist of it. And that's why this list operates this way. Where even my opinion is not the unit of measure for any of these guys. The unit of measure is equal for all of them across the board, and they are being measured against each other based on what each guy manages to accomplish ahead of or behind the other. That's the only real accurate measure. It's not what I think. It's not what you think. It's not who you think won. It's not who I think won. It's not based on any of our anecdotes. It's not based on anything that we think. It's based on what is done and what is proven and what is a matter of fact. Hence, spare me the opinions about, oh, I thought it was about skill. How the fuck can it be about skill and not about accomplishments when it takes skill to accomplish things? Idiots, you know. But it's a sport of boxing. You get those kinds of people. You know, you get those kinds of people. Idiots and anecdotes aside, these are the updates to the Ring IQ pound for pound list based on last night's fight. Congratulations to Canelo Alvarez, stellar showing. He ascends to the number 2 spot on the Ring IQ pound for pound list.